Very good. It's
Thank
1:15,
you.
and I apologize for the late start, but obviously it was with good reason. The swearing in of we had 10 new officers today, so that's a good thing. Thank everybody for coming today. We have really good attendance, and thank you for our city staff. Ryan, especially for the quick turnover. It was kind of like the Indy 500 where you jack up the car and put on the new tires and away we go. So, and today, basically, what our agenda is going to be, Jim is coming up to the podium, but basically it's discussion, and we will probably have a couple more of these meetings. We got a lot of public comments, but we would encourage more. And basically, that's what we're talking about today is just some of the potential changes to our policy. And I think we're off to a good start. So thank you, everybody, for coming. And with that, Jim, if you'd get us started.
Thank you. Just some updates first. We did get all these draft, policies sent out to a lot of developers. We were not able to get them on the website or get a public notice out. Our comm staff has been busy, and I was out last week, and so that didn't get done. So I think we'll want to still follow up and try to get more public comments in the future. I made some initial contact with the parks, and they would be willing to meet with us at a future meeting, talk about how that might affect their facilities and their thoughts on it. Planning and the growth plan, that's not going to be done till fall, but we can get some input from the planning department and probably that consultant again in the future. I included all the comments that we did receive. A lot of them are focused more, some of them wanted us to stick more to just redevelopment and kind of within our existing policy. Others had just more specific comments on the definitions. I think it'd be worthwhile to spend some time going through that. And then if we are going to make revisions, what kind of facilities do we want to support? Should it have to be a public facility? Should we be more focused on density? I'd like to get some of your thoughts on that. So maybe we can get comments on that first, but then also one of my thoughts is, and I think just the term P3 isn't a very common term except amongst planners and community development people. And so whether or not we change the name of this policy to more major projects or, maybe you have some other ideas rather than just be a P3, we have a broader policy that looks at more redevelopment as well as new development as we develop this. I did also talk with PFM, our financial consultant, and they might be able to provide some assistance. I don't have anything specific from them either. So again, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. I want to get your thoughts on the comments that we have received so far, and I don't know if you want to open it up again for any comments today.
So Jim, just a couple of quick things to start it off. So we still would welcome public comments. And so what do you recommend if there's somebody watching today or somebody that's interested in what's the direction that they should go?
I think in the next week we can get something up on the website where they can email directly to me, and then I can pass that on to you. So I'll work with Greg Schulberger on that.
And just a couple of more real quick ones. So P3, obviously that causes some confusion because of the diversion and some of the things that are going on there. And so to me, changing the terminology, I think that would be a good idea. Otherwise, and then one of the comments that was made that I saw was primary sector jobs. And that's kind of what the precedent has been in the past, that we focus on that. But I would say that's why kind of tourism forces us to look at least in that direction. And if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think whether it's tourism or some major facility, if we wanted to have a new convention center and wanted to get into a partnership with a developer and do it on someplace outside of the downtown, is that something that we would consider? And so we can kind of give some thought to that. The other is maybe it's not even tourism, but if we're trying to encourage density, do we have sort of a base level density that we know we're going to get regardless of any incentives? And then if someone builds, parking ramp and even greater density, one of the things that I don't have it to put on the screen, but the mayor was asking about, if you look at the last page of that handout I gave you, just to illustrate the size of the surface parking lot, the Block 9 ramp has just shy of 400 parking spaces. If you're trying to get 400 parking spaces in the downtown, you end up taking up an entire city block plus another half block plus the street in between. And so it just shows how surface parking can take up a tremendous amount of space that you then don't have development in. So there may be some advantage to doing that, but I think the growth plan can provide some guidance. Do we want that everywhere, or are there certain nodes in the community where we want to really encourage that super high density?
Very good. With that, we welcome comments from everybody up here, and if anybody in the audience wants to make a comment, please use that podium over there. But with that, anybody want to start us off? Well, we have a little bit of a shy group today, and that's okay. But I do think I'm very pleased that we're not rushing this, because I do think this is something that will have an impact for quite a while. And so to try to do it to feel like we were having a deadline. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I would just reiterate that. In reading these letters that we've gotten from a number of developers, I see that Alex is in the room. He sent one in, which is really helpful. But it seems to me that taking more time on this, truly understanding and making less subjective these measures so that it can be expanded moving forward in a way that is measurable is really useful, and even more simple. I agree. The public-private partnership as a title to me doesn't make a ton of sense. It should be, I think we definitely need to revisit that. But ultimately, can we look at something that's simpler in the sense that if they're in the areas that planning determines we want high density, is it simply a unit per acre number? And we say that you need to have, this is not the number, but we need to have 100 units per acre in this area, and then we'll be considered for incentives. And if you're under that, then you're not being considered for incentives, and we could keep it much more objective in that way. So I'm excited that we're having these conversations and moving towards a more objective measure. In my opinion, the simpler the better. I do get slightly concerned to finish on choosing specific types of projects that we should be considering. If we're putting museums or we're putting stadiums or we're putting that, to me, it gets to be a bit of a slippery slope. I would really like a sauna spa in Fargo. And so do I go out and get a developer to say, do you want to put a sauna spa in Fargo? Because I think it would be a good regional attraction, and then we can get some incentives on this. I just don't think picking winners and losers, unless it's very tightly defined, it should be up to this committee. So I'm excited to figure out how we can make it a little bit more economically driven, and based on a per acre or a per unit metric.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, I think those comments are great. I think just as we talk about, what is the language around this, if it's major projects or whatever it might be, to help us understand what problem we're trying to solve and help taxpayers understand. I think we should also be really intentional to kind of build off of what Lucas was saying about splitting the types of major projects that are considered, and then who also, which body takes action on which type of major project. So for instance, I think, defining if our goal is to build the economic resiliency of our tax base in the metro, then to establish parameters that if you can prove you're going above and beyond this, you're contributing to the long-term density of our region. And that's based on objective numbers, and this committee can poke and prod and make sure that those, the due diligence is done, but that it's very clear. So when we're messaging to taxpayers, this is being done because it's going to increase the long-term density of our tax base. And I think if we take the presentation that Epic gave a couple meetings ago, and all of those numbers are true, regardless of what's being built there, right? An incentive can net $80 million in additional development. And from my perspective, who works for our school board, it really shouldn't matter what the attraction is, but if we're leveraging incentives for longer term investment, then that's something we should take a hard look at. I worry if we look at major projects by type, to me, that those should almost bypass a committee like this altogether and go straight to the city commission, because those are going to be inherently political. who wants a sauna versus a museum versus a city center, and serving as ex officio for West Fargo's economic development group, you're going to have some times where then some proposals are almost not necessarily contradicting each other, but they come into conflict where you're trying to do a quality of life. There's a conversation about a quality of life project, and then there's also a conversation about the long-term economic, just the tax-based development, and that has put the committee in a hard part, in a tough spot, because those two things can sort of conflict with one another. So I think this dialogue is good, but I think just making sure that we're being very specific and almost creating maybe a separate process around a but-for test and some really clear pro forma requirements, if we can say that these incentives are to increase our yield, right? We're an agricultural powerhouse. If we think about every square foot within the diversion as an acre, we're trying to increase our yield. And we know that the market in the short term can yield this much. Well, we're looking for incentive fertilizer. So 50 years from now, we have a tax base that is much, much greater, and leave things about quality of life and other debates, and they have their place, but amongst political leaders because then it's essentially an asset allocation question as opposed to an economic development question. And I think I would hate to see economic development projects who are going to increase the long-term viability of our tax base be called into question if for some reason a tax incentive is given to an amenity that people don't like or don't support, and then all of a sudden all incentives get a bad brand. And I think some incentives have been used in really strategic ways in the city of Fargo, and I would hate to see a single project become the poster child for the reason why none of these should happen in the first place. So just being really clear about what we're trying to incentivize with the language that we use, the process that we use, and then ultimately the governing body that considers it.
That's great. Thank you, Levi. Go ahead, John.
Great points, Levi. One of the things that we keep talking about as a group here is what exactly we're looking for in a project. We did get some nice comments. I saw Alex, we received yours, some good points on the equity requirement. But my question is how, as a group, in conjunction with the public, can we aggregate all of these points that we're making, whether it's, does it meet property value increase? Does it need public assistance, design, infrastructure, competition with other development, everything? Aggregate all of them with public input, then go as a group, line by line, what are we looking for? Maybe that's in conjunction with the planning department, with our committee as a group, to where we've formed a policy based on public input and what's important for what we're looking for. And now we've essentially created a formula to where, okay, if it fits in this formula, it takes out less subjectiveness, so then we can make a decision and move forward. So like the one thing that I keep coming back to is we as a group are talking about this, but I still don't feel like we've got our arms around what we're looking for. And again, that comes back to the last meeting, asking the developers in the room, give us what you think is important, and also on top of that, any public citizen can come in. And so it's more of a question than a statement. How do we best do that?
That's good. Any other comments or questions? Mayor?
I think Ryan or Joe might be able to answer this, but it's on the primary sector question. Just so the public understands what primary sector is, and Jim, what we originally used primary sector in, which in my mind oftentimes was manufacturing. We're either incentivizing a manufacturer to expand, make a bigger business, and it wouldn't necessarily be in the downtown site. It could be anywhere. And has that changed over time? I mean, to me, I think the simplistic idea the legislative body had at one time was any manufacturing company in your town, we will help to grow by doing something, quote, for primary sector. What then stirs us away not for primary sector? So if you look at the water park issue, what is it that would disqualify it for that setting, Joe?
So Mayor and committee, I think there's no black and white answer to your question, but maybe some boundaries around it. Over the years in different municipalities, different states, they've set little different definitions as to what a primary sector enterprise is. As we see it here within the Greater Fargo-Moorhead Economic Development Corporation, it's an entity that produces a majority of its revenue from selling its products and or services, so it doesn't have to be manufacturing, around the globe, across the country and around the globe. They're bringing new money into this market. And that's critically important, because once that money comes in, then it churns through all the other businesses that survive off the local economy. So, the state of North Dakota might define it as 60, 70% of revenue. We're looking at a majority of revenue with that core business. It can get even, quite frankly, a little bit more complicated, because you might have an enterprise like, I'll use Drecker Brewing. It started off local, but now they're selling in 33 states and 15 countries. We've supported them on that growth beyond the local marketplace and looking at a majority of their income. So it can be business by business or a sector within that business. Bottom line for the work we do is are you here as a business and you could locate somewhere else and still serve your client? We don't want you to, of course. And if you can do that, then you're our client. We want to keep you here. We want to help you grow here. And I think one of the messages I would emphasize, and I've heard from several of you, is, whatever policy direction you go, I know we want to, as the EDC, make sure that the primary sector opportunities in our market are still supported. And the city of Fargo has done that time and again in the 5 years that I've been here. So to Levi's point, sometimes if you throw these other opportunities out, you don't want to confuse to the citizenry the value of continuing to support those primary sector projects. I'd also just add, when you look at tourism, because that was brought up, Charlie Johnson and I have had many conversations. We've seen it happen where somebody comes in to town for a convention or an activity, and they realize what this region has to offer, and then they want to talk to us about expanding their business enterprise here. And of course, those people are bringing money into the marketplace, initially just through tourism and the kinds of activities that some of the projects that have been mentioned would probably fit under. So it's no black and white to this, but I think some of these guideposts are pretty important.
Dave?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think one of the unique things about this project is if I look at Block 9, about $120 million downtown. We sold a parking lot that they took and they're going to manage. We don't have to manage it. Commissioner Preston has talked about what do we do in parking lots, and this is a good example, is we don't have to maintain or own it or run it, and that decreases the cost for the city. Levi, to your point, if it brings an additional $60 or $80 million to the project to do this, is that worth value net in the long term because of the taxability of that project? So I think the complexity of this project is exactly that. You're going to do $180 million, 120, or 100. And if you do a 10-year TIF, is that enough to TIF it? Eagle Ridge just did a project down South Fargo, 92 people per acre, and it's 4 apartment complexes together. Put parking underneath the building for 1 tenant per person, and then put a parking on the street. Well, that decreased the parking lot presence, which we're talking about here, is we're decreasing the amount of surface space you use. And I think Commissioner Pepcorn has always talked about, initially when Fargo started downtown, all these parking lots we had that just stood around and did nothing. Block 9 is a good example. I think we got $45,000 taxable income from that. When the project is done, it bumps to $1 million in taxes. So I think that it gets a little complex, tourist versus not tourist, or where we go with it. But if I think of this team here, what we look at is, quote, economic development. What does it bring to the city if we didn't do it? And to try to kind of make it, I know we're trying to customize it just because we've got a water park on the table, but the reality is the TIF is going to the apartment complexes and a parking ramp and decreasing per parking surface lot, basically. And so I don't know, Jim, how we tighten that up or make it simple, but concur that if we make it too complex for one project, how will it go forward? And I think what we're really talking about is when we get in green space, what do? We kind of know what we do in brown space, but we don't always know what we do in green space. And Commissioner Pipcorn is that the version is defining us. We only have so much land. So we really don't want to be cavalier about what we put out in that land when we might be able to get a taxable benefit by putting the most density in areas. And to us, a area South Fargo with residential is about 8 per acre. So it's a huge difference. If we jump to 60, 70, 80 per acre, that really does increase our density, and that changes the whole venue of the community. So I concur, Lucas, you and I were talking before, it is how do you make a policy that we can go out and do for other projects, in which this one seems kind of unique. You got Park Board involved, you got Sioux involved, you got a variety of different players involved. Will we ever hit that again? But if we try to focus just on economic impact, I think that might be a better way to land.
Yeah, I think I like that idea of kind of setting some base, and I don't know where that dollar amount is, but we know that we'll get a certain amount of dollar per square foot if we, just allow the regular development to occur. On the other hand, with Mayor mentioned Block 9 over, get $100 million on one block, that's over $1,000 per square foot. That's got to be the highest, probably along with Bill Bank, as far as revenue, future property tax revenue per square foot. And it costs about the same to provide city services, per square foot, or much of it's the same. So I think the question is, and maybe we can get a committee, or maybe not a committee, but this group could look at some typical developments in Fargo, see what kind of density we have now, and then try to decide where do we want to set that line where, if you get to $100 a square foot, but you build $200, we'll give you a property tax decrease on that incremental increase. The other thing that's important, I think, is that we kind of maintain these current policies on economic development where it's really jobs that we create and investment. And so I don't think we need to change that policy where we have that goal just as a goal of more low-income housing. It's not necessarily about density. It's about trying to provide lower cost units. And so we kind of stay with that policy there, along with the redevelopment policies to try to clean up brownfield. So yeah, this is really more focused on newly developed areas than our other policies. So.
John, comments?
Well, when this first came up, I kind of just went back to the original purpose of urban renewal and tax increment and different things. And so my immediate reaction was, well, no, this is greenfields, forget about it. But I think what we're starting to realize now is just about every time a consultant comes into the city and they look at the city, they always say, well, you've got all these parking lots. You need to make your city walkable. You need to make your city dense. You need to pull the buildings out to the sidewalk. And then it's like, well, yeah, you haven't walked here in the winter. I mean, so as this develops, I think what we're really talking about is looking at a project and the required surface parking for that project, and then saying, can we provide an incentive that will, as you pointed out, Levi, increase the overall tax base of that project by assisting with the building of a ramp or more dense parking, whatever that may be, underground, above ground. And if we focus on that, then we don't have to kind of pick the losers and winners. Is that, if we look at a project and say, okay, surface parking, the example in there of a full city block versus a ramp of, a quarter of that block, and then what's the additional taxable value that goes on that land. And then it becomes a pretty easy discussion, is that we should invest in that to get the return long term. And I think we're getting closer with that policy that I like those type of situations where you can say, what's our role in this? And yes, we're trading today's tax dollars for future tax dollars. But if we don't do this, and as we look out in the newly developing areas around there, Shields Arena, huge open parking lot. And this project's gonna have a huge open parking lot, and each major project that we come to is gonna have large surface parking. And 25 years from now, we'll be coming back saying, can we improve the density? We've grown to the city, the extension of the diversion. Now, we start tearing up parking lots and trying to figure out how to fit it back in. So it makes sense to me to be on the front end. And I think density and that trade-off between additional taxable value becomes pretty clear to identify.
Do you have any comments, Jessica? I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, I think we need more listening to our developers, to our groups that have things to say. We have 4 in front of us. We've heard a couple others, but there's a lot more involvement that's happening in building this wonderful community than just those voices. So as we think about it, I would like to challenge those other groups that haven't spoken out to come and tell us what they feel and think, so that we can get as many inputs, data inputs, as the people that are doing the work on the ground as possible, so we can make actionable decisions. I think we have really good assumptions, really good things we know, but now we need the color. We need the things that we don't necessarily do every day to fill in. So I'm still waiting to hear more perspectives from various different groups.
And I just wanted to say, the other thing is, I think it's great, because I think the Planning Commission, there's a lot of things that will impact this, and you had a list, Jim, thank you for doing that, the Municipal Parking Authority Act. Well, there's some legal things that are required now that might have to change in the future. In the Planning Department, we have some requirements for parking that might have to change. Well, that would impact how we look at a lot of these things. So I do think that is one of that's why I'm glad we're not rushing, because I think we have to make sure we're all, like you said, getting a lot of input from a lot of different parties, and we still have a long way to go. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, Jim?
Yeah, I think, I know we're a little tight on time for some of us today, but maybe what we could do is we're scheduled to meet again in a week, and maybe that meeting could just be a listening session where we encourage more developers to come in and kind of give us, their ideas, and we can, get something out to the members of the public, and then use our September meeting to try to craft, a new policy on what that might be. Be a little slower approach than we maybe would like to do, but I think it's better to spend the time and get something people are comfortable with.
So can I ask you, Jim, so what is the date of the next one tentatively right now? It's in
be,
September?
Would be August 22nd, would be a week from today, and then whatever the fourth Tuesday in August or in September is would be.
So what your concept is the next meeting be a listening session where we'd try to encourage people to come and talk to us?
Yes.
Does that sound acceptable to everybody? Is that a good idea?
Lucas had so.
Would you, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I guess what I'm wondering is it this format or a similar format to what we did a few weeks ago, Commissioner Pepcorn, where we have folks around a table, invite folks to actually come and have a conversation that's a little more in-depth? I'm sure all these folks are fine coming up to the podium and having and speaking, but it feels like it's a little more productive if we can all just get around a table, have an hour, and have people submit what their suggestions are before for review. I think that might be more productive, and I don't.
Lucas, if you want us to have a circular table, we will have a
If
circular
we can
table.
put a circular table right here for everybody, that'd be terrific. Yeah.
That's an excellent thing. And I think we maybe should, and I don't know if a week is long enough, but we want to encourage more people to come and participate. I think, and maybe that's up to each of us to make sure we try to invite some people. But I do like that. That's a good point. Instead of us sitting up here, to have us all around a table where everyone feels welcome to make comments. So, Mayor.
Just, Jim, one thing I'd like to have us show is, I think there's an investment of $180,000, plus they're putting in a $20 million, or $180 million, and they're putting in a $20 million parking ramp. And I just like the difference of how many parking lot cars per parking lot, cars in garage, and then the difference in square footage of what we'll see on that. I know you guys did a map, Blake, but I'm kind of curious what trade-offs we're getting. And if you'd be so kind, because I don't do the mathematics that well, but to tell me taxable, what I'm going to get in taxes out of either project, maybe a side-by-side. Here's what we do if we don't do a parking ramp. Here's what we do if we do a parking ramp. And again, I think our team, the commissioners, are kind of concerned about long-term costs of the parking ramp. We'd have none if they own it, as far as I know. And that's a plus for the city. I mean, because otherwise we have to pay maintenance and upkeep of a parking ramp. So could we put some of those dynamics just so we can see it? And if we give if we give them a TIF or if we don't give them a TIF, and I think the committee's on 10 years, so that's kind of what I think we're at. But it would just help us to better, if we're going to go more in a pure economic and density and idea, and I don't know the density, I don't know if we talked about that, Blake, as far as density per site. And then I think your other comment was the $1,000 per square foot. It'd be nice to know that, what kind of investment we're getting, because I think the public would like to know that. I mean, Block 9 was a blessing to us all. It was a fantastic project because of all the other things that stimulated. Will this project also stimulate other things in South Fargo?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of off the top of my head, generally a parking space takes up 350 to 400 square feet. And what they're proposing is 500 car ramp with about 100 spots. So that's about 40,000 square feet. Well, if you spread that out, now you need to add, 4 times 40,000, that's 160,000 square feet, well over 3 to 4 acres that's now available to develop well over probably 1.5 city blocks that you can get development on rather than surface parking. So those are the.
But I don't get a lot of taxable value out of that parking lot, right? I mean, we get zip, I don't know, Dave, what, 45,000 maybe for it or something? We don't get much money for a parking lot.
Yeah, I think the city assessor says it's about $5 a square foot, where, again, Block 9's $1,000 a square foot. So which would you rather have?
One of my comments on this, again, going back to what I said about aggregating all these ideas and maybe getting some input is, in this next session, can we have the planning and zoning and potentially any other city representation? And have they been involved in the process at all? Just because, I just think we need some city representation at the next one to get their input, personally.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll talk to the planning department, see if we can loop in the consultants or the staff that are working with the consultants on the growth plan, just to give you an update on where that process is.
Okay.
Commissioner Preston's here. I don't know if she wants to make any comments about where we are in the process or have any thoughts on that.
And part of it is we've brought this up before, like, okay, if you do a ramp, now what does the water retention look like? I mean, I know that somebody, a developer brought that up at the previous meeting where, okay, that I don't think the two are talking to each other type of situation where you maybe naturally you have less water retention and then you're getting more density, you're getting more taxable value long-term. So
That's a good
where I
point,
think
less impervious area.
yeah, so I just think that we
parking.
need some city representation from the city departments.
Well, and I guess just piggybacking off of that a little, if we are asking developers and other folks that build around the city to come in and give their comment and give their thoughts on how to do this, not having we're saying, hey, we're considering having high density areas in these parts of the city. What are your thoughts, right? Letting them in, giving them a little bit more information on what that might look like might yield better feedback on the plans that we're trying to make. Because towards John's point, I'm unsure of where it's headed. So getting that feedback and then also providing that to the folks who are building could help us, again, refine the conversation that we're having.
Yeah, some of increasing density is just, maybe instead of an 80-foot lot, you have a 50-foot lot. And so it's more of a marginal increase versus this real high density mixed-use developments that are even more efficient.
Right. Yeah. No. I think that's an important part of the conversation because whether it's brownfield or greenfield, I think John, your reflection is apt. At the end of the day, it either makes economic sense or it doesn't. And if you can increase your tax base density, whether it might be a marginal increase of we're not talking $1,000 a square foot. We're not going to see block 9s in every corner of the city, but just as planning and development looks out into their growth plans. I mean, whether it's affiliating some level of marginal expectation based on how something is zoned. I mean, I think this idea of incentivizing taking that next extra leap, I think there would be a lot of interesting dialogue to have around that. I do wonder, I think the document you shared, Jim, was helpful for just to kind of wrap our mind around, like, so we have all this conversation, what does that actually mean when the rubber hits the road? I'm personally a little less interested in the amenity conversation, but I think it would be premature until we hear from more stakeholders to say, one way or the other. I do wonder if there would be some value in almost replicating that rubric, and you have major projects, tax base enhancement, and major projects amenities, and we can just be really clear about which one we're talking about. And I think to the mayor's point, just as we're having developers apply for these incentives, one of the things that Commissioner Peterson for the county has said that I think there's a lot of truth to is, so if you're filling this out and you're requesting it at 20 years, so this is at 20, what does that mean from a development standpoint? What would we get if it was 15 years, 10 years, 0 years? Because I think one of the helpful things for me when, Epic, made their presentation, and for me, this is about tax-based development, has nothing to do with whatever they're building there. But if you can clearly see this is what you get for this amount of money with no incentive, and this is what you get with a certain incentive and this much money, we can help taxpayers and the general public realize that some of these projects, we're just working in their long-term best interest. And so I think trying to separate some of those and make that even more transparent on the front end, because then I think as part of that brown bag with developers, there was some discussion at the last meeting about if we are really going to have I think we should have a separate process for this tax-based development. What are some of those key due diligence stress test variables that, I don't work into development, but we had heard, last time here about what their debt coverage ratios are, whether that's managerial fees. I mean, you pick whatever it is, but we can get even more refined to ensure that anybody who is, submitting for one of these tax-based enhancement incentives, money isn't being moved around, dollars aren't being done. We have our stress test, but we can make it very clear that these are what some of our expectations are if you are indeed going to apply for one. Because I think the most important thing that we don't want to lose in this process is trust that incentives can do good things for all taxpayers. Because if we lose that, then I think we have passed up a really big opportunity to ensure we have a resilient tax base when the diversion ultimately kind of defines our urban growth boundary.
Yeah, and really quickly on top of that, I mean, simplifying it to are you expanding the tax base or aren't you, really takes out of the question, is the public actually going to be using this? I think Alex's comment on, do we know how much public use, was there a public use study on the parking garage that we're trying to incent and in the WAVE project? I think that's a legitimate question. I also think if we're just saying, hey, we want the $80 million in additional development, and that question goes out the window, maybe they get a parking ramp, it's more dense, awesome. We don't have to consider and do it, have additional consideration to say, hey, this is, 5 people a night are going to be parking here or not. No, the base has grown and it's more dense, and that's the end of the discussion. But outside of that, it gets, again, a little bit more subjective, a little bit more difficult to pin down. So simplicity it probably should win the day here.
And then I'd hope next week, Jim, when we have our meeting, the other question would be asked is that we've got the housing study done now. We know we need affordable housing. What would stimulate affordable houses? How can we stimulate affordable housing? We did 17,000 units over the last 10 years. We need to do 13,000 over the next 10 years. But what can we do to incentivize that to happen for us? And what would be the recommendation, and maybe the development community is why would you build something that's affordable, or how we could do that? We have 44 units going downtown, Dave, that we did with Beyond Shelter, and we're going to have 100 units at Kmart site. So the city is investing in that. We put $1 million into that. So we have done some of that. But if we're doing tax exempt to get more things, what is it that would make it easier for a developer to do that? Because that's going to be really the question. Got too many jobs, not enough housing, and we got to somehow stimulate people to build in spite of the interest rates. So if there's methods which people can suggest that would help us as a committee incentivize, I think that'd be great.
Oh, we'll just get notice out for the meeting a week from today and go with more of a roundtable. Thank you.
So once again, I apologize for a late start today, and we'll make sure that we have our time allotted correctly so we don't get pushed back. But thank you, everybody, for coming. And I hope that's okay that we're meeting a little more frequently, but I hope that's okay. But I think we're making good progress. Thank you, everybody, for their comments. Once again, if anybody from the public wants to make a comment, you're welcome at any time. And then we'll try to get that up on our city website so we can have the opportunity for people to do that before the next meeting. With that, it's 1:55. We are adjourned. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.